You know what I always say, Dan? I don't hate to say I told you so, because I did tell you so. And we've been through this for a couple of years now, where you had this narrative that the reason that Eric Bieniemy wasn't getting a head coaching job was because the NFL is full of racists. Well, it turns out that there's other reasons that Eric Bieniemy hasn't gotten a job. And again, I'm going to take you back through it. Okay? I'm going to take you back through it. I spoke to one of the general managers who had interviewed Eric Bieniemy and walked away liking him a whole lot more than he thought bringing him in terms of the perception of him from others in the business whom he talked to. But the issue was that couldn't really figure out what he did in Kansas City, right? They had a run game coordinator, passing game coordinator, and though he was the offensive coordinator, Andy Reid called the plays. But even that is not really a determinant as to whether or not you want to hire a guy. But what was interesting was that, one, there wasn't necessarily a clear plan, or especially in comparison to other candidates for this particular job, as clear a plan as others. And there was does Kansas City really want him? You know, they want to keep him. If you go back 1 year ago, there was talk of Eric Bieniemy's contract not being renewed. They did renew him. They did win a Super Bowl. And yet, here he is, an offensive coordinator. He got more money, and he was making a good amount of money in Kansas City, but it felt like a parallel move with an inferior kind of roster, right? And now you have an ownership change. He wasn't named head coach in waiting. And, oh, yeah, by the way, if Kansas City really wanted to keep him and thought he was really, really valuable, and he's only leaving to be a coordinator, then why wouldn't you come at least close financially? And, you know, Andy Reid's not going to coach forever. You name him head coach in waiting, right? But that wasn't done because this is who Eric Bieniemy is, right? He's a guy who, if you remember, he got into it with Patrick Mahomes several times on the sideline, and that can happen. It's happened with Bill O'Brien. It's happened with Bill Belichick. It's happened, you know, with Tom Brady. We've seen that happen before. But what I had been told is all that's played out. And yeah, it is. Dan Byer pointed out perfectly. It's different to have a coach kind of take the side of some of the players. But if this was simply an isolated incident and he was just too tough, too old school, and players were too soft or whatever, then it wouldn't be an issue. But there's obviously a there, and we're in the season. They haven't played a game. They haven't played a scrimmage yet. They've only played each other. And there's already infighting within the Commanders' coaching staff in relationship to how they're receiving his word. Then I heard this. This is Shady McCoy on Fox Sports 1 talking about Eric Bieniemy.
The type of attitude that he uses to approach the game with is so outdated, right? You don't find coaches swearing the players out or cussing them out over the small details. And the first thing when I got to the Chiefs, I learned fast, like, whoa, that's his approach. He's cussing these dudes out. That's not coaching. That's yelling. And the funny thing is, these players are complaining. It's only been like 2 weeks. It's been like 2 weeks. So you're going to get more of it and more of it. And I'm sure when Rivera made them comments, like, these are not freaking rookies complaining. The rookie ain't going to come to the head coach and talk about the coordinator. No. It's like the third string. These are starters, I'm sure. These are starters that's talking about, hey, man, hey, look, coach, hey, you know, I get it. He's coaching me hard, but I can't. My tolerance with him is running short. And he wears on you. He is yelling and complaining about every little small detail. It's like, how can I get better as a player? See, the problem, I think, with Eric Bieniemy as a coach, and I'm speaking only on experiences, is that he really can't relate to the players. And it sounds funny because he was an ex-player. You would think he would know. That's what makes Andy Reid such a great coach, because he could adjust and adapt to every era of football, right? Back then, he was back there with the Packers back in the day. I'm sure it was a lot tougher how to communicate to players. And then as the game evolves, as he gets older, you have to learn how to adjust to these players. And that's the only thing I see with Eric Bieniemy is he doesn't know how to adjust to his players. And they're going to continue to talk about this. And there's another thing is, we haven't even seen him have a bad game or loss. You complain after 2 weeks of camp. Imagine when you have a loss to the Eagles by 21 points. right? You're going to hear a lot of more complaining. So I hope he can understand that, going forward.
This show is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Progressive makes bundling easy and affordable. Get a multi-policy discount by combining your motorcycle, RV, boat, ATV, and more. All your protection in one place. Bundle and save at Progressive.com. The number one misconception in hiring coaches in 2023 is that in order to relate to players, you have to have been a player. And frankly, a lot of them, it's better off if you're black. It just is. It's a common theme is that, like, look, we saw with the Celtics. Hey, man, they're not listening to Brad Stevens because Brad's Division III player, great college coach, kind of a nerd, right? Ime Udoka, former player, a guy who grinder, made it to the NBA. They can relate. And on some level, there is some of that. There's no question. But relating to the players is not necessarily about your background. It's not necessarily about your age. It's not necessarily about whether or not you played. It's just whether or not you can relate to players and whether or not they'll listen to you. Here's a perfect example. In radio, Colin Cowherd, what do you think the best thing he does? And I know, look, we all make mistakes and we could point to things that he said wrong. But Colin is completely invested in football. And the thing he actually knows best is recruiting. And he's really into the SC thing, but he really knows recruiting, national recruiting, whatever. And Colin didn't play. He hadn't coached. He hadn't recruited. He didn't work at Rivals or 24/7 or whatever. He's just completely engrossed in it and has a way of communicating it. What makes you a great radio or TV host is not necessarily that you played or that you coach. It's that, can people relate to your message? Do you have, some form of proof? I think it obviously helps if you played, but it is not the end all be all. Does it help if you're black? Of course, on some level. If you've seen some of the things and been through some of the things that some of these guys are going through, absolutely. But the number one thing is, guys either buy in or they don't buy in. And the other part, and this is the Andy Reid thing, look, he has two boys. One obviously is, I think, still in jail. The other one died. When you've lived a life as a parent, you can relate a lot more to younger people. And so you're like, well, how can he relate to this generation? Well, he had two young kids that grew up in football and then became coaches or around him, and he lost one tragically. Okay, and another one made a series of tragic mistakes, which led to a loss of life. But we have people who have made a decision about who somebody is and based upon what their background is, when people are just different. Right? Some former players are brilliant. Some former players are not. Derek Jeter, for example, who's now a broadcaster, right? Derek Jeter, he used to tell people all the time, he didn't watch baseball when he played baseball. He wasn't all about the major leagues. He was a Yankee. He was a great player. He studied the pitchers he was going to play against. He worked on his own game, and then he had a great life. And so to put him on TV before he had really been engrossed in the game would have been a mistake. Instead, and it didn't work out well with him running the Marlins, but there's a perfect example, right? Here's a guy who's as decorated a player as there has ever been, as respected a player as there's ever been, and he was a disaster with the Marlins. But now, because he's been kind of engrossed in the game for a couple of years, he's actually really good on TV, right? But it's not because he's black. It's not because he played. That helps. That gives you a little bit more equity. But it's also because of the amount of knowledge that he's been able to soak up and his ability to communicate it. I mean, look, we look around at coaches, and there's no magic. There's no one way to do it. There's no one race to do it. There's no one background to do it. But many of the former quarterbacks are coaches. And because quarterbacks are guys that have to find a way to win over the locker room. Right? Have to win over the locker room. And the Bill Belichick thing worked for a long time, but it worked for a long time because, well, he was with Parcells and they won, and then he started winning almost initially or very soon after with the Patriots. And once you start winning, now you can start barking around orders. And Belichick, honestly, is a little bit different when the cameras aren't on, and I'm sure he's a lot warmer. Eric Bieniemy is walking around like he's a Belichick disciple, even though he comes from Andy Reid's, family tree. And it's just like the Belichick guys, not being received well. It's not because he's black. It's not because he's a former player, but because he lacks that bedside manner, right? That's what they call it with doctors, right? That bedside manner to be able to get guys to buy into what he wants to do. And this was part of the narrative for why he hasn't gotten a head coaching job. And I don't think Andy Reid is trying to keep him from getting his job with the Commanders. I think he's trying to paint the picture and check his coach a little bit and back his players, because that's what a head coach has to do. A head coach has to win and own the locker room. If you lose that locker room, it doesn't matter what you draw up. Doesn't matter what you call. Doesn't matter how tough your team is or how good your players are. If you don't have your locker room, you lose. And so he had to pick this past week, right? He's had to pick Bieniemy or my locker room. And he chose his locker room. And I think now we're getting a clearer picture of why Eric Bieniemy, to this point, doesn't have a head coaching job. It's not because the league is racist. Okay? Nothing nefarious about it. It's just about his reputation, which is earned in his inability to be beloved by many of the players that he coaches. And then some of the other detail-oriented things, which I think, again, it's a little bit of an old school philosophy, right? Old school, they were not as detail-oriented. They did not use analytics nearly as much. They did not have the ability to draw up and diagram all different sorts of options, of plays, of route combinations, whatever. You have to evolve or die. And I think his style of putting together a coaching staff, his style of putting together a playbook, all of that is, hey, let's just kind of go out there and play, and, getting on guys about little things and the way in which he relates to people, to this point, hasn't hit the right marks. Fascinating to watch what happens with the Commanders. I don't hate to say I told you so, because I did. I told you so. This is why he hasn't gotten a job, and this is why it doesn't look great so far. Like Shady McCoy said, 2 weeks in, and they're already bitching? That's not good.